Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalin. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاح الخالد عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاح الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقول هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية،
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
For a few days, though I hope that you all got a chance to hear the interview I did with Michael Christopher, the Communist Party of the USA member who's based in Laos and who has been covering the reignited, or should we say, new stage of the insurgency against the military regime in Myanmar/Burma. So be sure to take a look out for that. That's available on all reputable and disreputable podcast platforms, so you can find that on Spotify and elsewhere. It's a very interesting interview, and I would recommend you check it out. Also released on Patreon and going to be coming up this week on the main channel is, of course, the interview we did also with Matteo Capasso, who we've had on before about Libya. We're going to be talking to him, we have spoken to him indeed, about the situation in Palestine, and it's a very interesting discussion. That's going to be out for everybody on Friday of this week. So definitely something you will want to check out there, the conversation with him. Right, and you may have noticed that we have a new background, and that is, of course, an experimental thing that I'm engaging in. If it's something that looks good, I'm going to try and find something that is more fitting than an animated bookcase, but that'll do for now. Looking to make the show a little bit more technically proficient. So any advice that those of a more artistic sensibility than me, and that wouldn't be hard because I have the artistic talent of a concussed badger. So anybody out there who wants to provide advice on potential backgrounds, feel free to do so. I was thinking of putting a sketch of like futuristic Soviet art behind me, but I haven't been able to find an image in time. So on the agenda for today, censorship in the UK, it's a thing apparently, and police harassment of comrades of mine over the weekend. We'll be getting into that. There was the matter of the Dublin riots at the end of last week, and there's certain things that need to be said about that. There is also, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. We will get to that at some point in the next couple of hours, and we have the situation in Palestine as well. But before we get underway, we should look at who is in the chat and say hello to relevant participants. So, James Graham, good afternoon. Tobias, hello to you. Peter, my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion. Tobias is apparently enjoying the intro music. Good afternoon to Jerry, who's enjoying a dull afternoon in Hampshire. Ash, who's saying good evening from Chennai in India. Good evening to you. Hello to Tusker, who's joining us for the first time in a while. And Cypher, who's over in Kópavogur. I have probably bollocksed up that Icelandic pronunciation, but good afternoon to you. Lee, good afternoon. And Steve Richter. And Kato, who's coming to us from Hualien on the east coast of Taiwan. Truly a global audience today. Shawnee McAdams says Z, and I say it back to you. Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, says it's minus 10 degrees centigrade over in Minsk, cold and snowy. Well, the snow is coming to Britain, but I guess in much lower quantities than you find it over in Belarus. And good afternoon to Burke. Jerry, I'm glad you enjoyed the interview with Michael Christopher. Good afternoon to CJ, who suggests a good Soviet mural for the background. AK, hello from London. Jay, good morning to you over, I think you're in Norfolk, Virginia, unless my memory plays tricks on me. Good afternoon to Beiju down in the great city of London. And Moonis, good afternoon. And Dingo Ate Me Baby, who says hello, Confam. And Zuleika, good afternoon. Okay, and Cypher says close enough with the pronunciation. Good, because my knowledge of Icelandic is limited to, well, absolutely nothing. So we will proceed. My knowledge of Nordic languages in general is atrocious anyway, so it's not just Icelandic I'm not versed in. Which is remarkable when you consider that the part of the Britain that I'm from has actually one of the largest impacted in terms of the Nordic culture, given that the old Viking kingdoms used to stretch all the way through the northeast, through Yorkshire and into the northwest of England, where I'm from originally. But the language didn't stick around other than, of course, the long-lasting linguistic influences in English anyway, which, as anybody who's ever tried to learn English as a second language or third language knows, English is a real bastard to actually learn, because its words come from several different influences, and some of its words make absolutely no sense. Try explaining how through and through in its different meanings means different things, despite often being spelt the same way. Or try and tell somebody whose first language isn't English how to spell thorough properly. It's a bizarre language. So, moving on to the first item on our agenda. So we have censorship, police harassment, etc. You may be familiar with this story already if you've been following the postings on the Telegram group and on Twitter, or X if you prefer. You will have seen the CPGBML comrades of mine, members of the same party as me, being arrested over the course of the weekend on the basis or on the grounds that they were selling a pamphlet, which I think you can still get, though I'm not sure about that at the moment. You can certainly still get it in PDF and audio format. The pamphlet, which made a correct analysis of the origins of Zionism, which is that it comes out of a tradition that is, if not outright fascist, then heavily influenced by fascism. And it's not just communists saying that, though of course we're the ones who say it with the most forcefully. Even religious Jewish organizations, like if you listen to the interview that Katie Halper did with Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, for instance, or others from the True Torah Jews group, they also make the argument that Zionism came out of a largely secular tradition that based itself partly on various different anti-rational and romanticist philosophical traditions, including the influence of people like Nietzsche, or a certain version of Nietzsche, shall we say. I know that Nietzsche scholars out there will argue that Nietzsche himself wasn't a fascist, but I don't think we can really dispute the fact that Nietzsche's work was certainly appropriated by various fascistic groups. So what happened was that over a week ago now, on the 18th of November, apparently the Metropolitan Police, which, if you're not familiar with them, they are the largest single police force in Britain, because of course they cover the entirety of London. And other than, of course, the City of London, which has its own police force, which is mainly accountable to the City of London banks. And that's another matter entirely. But the Metropolitan Police, the largest police force in Britain, often regarded, even by other police forces, as the most repressive, the most corrupt, the most likely to have various criminals and fascists and sex criminals in its ranks. The one that is the most overtly political, because it's the one that is, of course, in the capital city. It's always had an incredibly bad reputation, even amongst liberals. So let's just start with that. But on November the 18th, they apparently took an interest in the book that, again, makes the correct analysis of Zionism as a particular form of fascism, and has an image on the front cover which contains the swastika inside the Star of David. Now, I want to make a point about this, which is that, again, we're not the ones who invented this. Various Zionists and fascists have already made this link themselves. So, for instance, if you look at the friends of the British government in Ukraine, I shouldn't say friends, the temporary allies of the British government in Ukraine, many of them who are Zionists have actually combined fascist imagery with Zionist imagery. In fact, there's personified, of course, in some of the Ukrainian oligarchs who hold Ukrainian and Israeli passports. They've managed to combine an aggressive form of Zionism with an aggressive form of Ukrainian fascism, despite the fact, of course, the Ukrainian fascist organizations, going all the way back to the days of Semyon Petlura, viciously persecuted the Jewish population of Ukraine. That doesn't matter, of course, to the various oligarchs, including Kolomoisky, who have funded the fascist organizations whilst also being citizens of Israel. Fascism and Zionism have always been compatible with each other. Again, this isn't something that we dreamed up. This is something that is documented by multiple sources, including historians inside Israel, of collaboration between the Nazis, the Italian fascists, and the Zionist movement. And this was an enthusiastic collaboration on the part of the Zionists. So not only does some of their, or a large chunk of the theoretical and philosophical foundations of Zionism share an intellectual tradition with fascism, based on sort of romanticism, irrationality, a worship of sort of an imagined community, which is what Zionism is, and of course a complete misappropriation of religion, taking the anti-Semitic argument that Judaism is not a religion, but in fact an ethnicity. That's an anti-Semitic argument. Always has been, an anti-Jewish argument. Because as the True Torah Jews group argues, the Judaism is just the relationship between a believer and the Torah. And if you take the Torah away, then you're not Jewish anymore. That's their argument, and it's an argument that, in fact, I think it makes complete sense, given that if you remove the Bible from the Christian, if you remove the beliefs from the Christian, no one would consider, for instance, me to be a Christian. First of all, I've not been baptized. Second of all, I, despite having read the Bible and tried at various points to absorb its lessons and searched for the Almighty, was unable to find him anywhere. So no one would say that I am a Christian. I don't go to a church. I don't even go on seasonal holidays. I'm not baptized. I don't pray. I don't observe any single Christian ritual. My parents were baptized. And so would you argue that I've inherited an ethnic Christianity? It doesn't make any sense at all. Now, there are those, of course, who describe themselves as secular Jews, but to my mind, I mean, that's more of a cultural claim that, to be honest, doesn't make any sense. Just like I won't call myself a cultural Christian. It would make no sense whatsoever. Or somebody would describe themselves as a cultural Muslim. It doesn't make any sense. If you're not practicing the religion, you're not part of the religion. It's as simple as that. You can give up the Bible, and therefore you give up the Christian religious practices. You're no longer Christian anymore. And the same applies to Jews, which is the point that the Orthodox Jews make, and I think that they're largely correct. I mean, you probably wouldn't agree with them on a whole range of other issues. But the point being that Zionism takes the anti-Semitic arguments of like 19th century European anti-Semitism and takes them into like a new direction. Basically takes all those negatives and tries to turn them into a positive by saying that the way in which the anti-Semites argued that the Jews were a separate, distinct group, almost a separate race that couldn't join European societies, because that stems from after the Napoleonic War and the breaking down of the old feudal system completely in its political forms, which was slowly broken down over the period of the Napoleonic Wars and afterwards, and probably reached a conclusion at around just about after the 1848 revolutions, with the final elements of the political survivals of feudalism were slowly stamped out. So there was also during that time, of course, when a large element of the more secular Jews tried to integrate with European society at that time, you got the anti-Semitic pushback, particularly in the petty bourgeoisie, where the Jews were seen as competition in the professions, especially. So that's where like a lot of the modern anti-Semitism comes from, and it's of course whipped up by particularly ultra-reactionary regimes. The worst for it in the 19th century was the Russian Tsardom, but a lot of the other European states weren't much better. And their argument was that the Jews aren't just a religious group, that they're a separate, distinct race. And if you go and look up some of the old cartoons or diagrams even from the 19th century, where they tried to construct a hierarchy of the races. And this is very common from the period of social Darwinism. You'll find that there is various different groups are at the bottom, but the Jews are often at the bottom, below even the colonized Africans or the Indians. The white man or the white Christian man is, of course, at the top. But the way they constructed it was that the Jews were always near the bottom of the pyramid, or not even in the pyramid sometimes. So this sort of fake science, race science, pseudoscience, propaganda that sought to portray the Jews as another racial group was all wrapped up in Zionism, in that they took all those anti-Semitic arguments and said, you know what, Mr. Karl Lueger, former mayor of Vienna, who was a big influence on Adolf Hitler, you're right, we can't live amongst you, we are a separate people, and that's good. Yeah, we're a people who are actually better than anybody else, and so we must leave this Europe behind that won't accept us and find ourselves a place where we can engage in colonialism. And there's always been the essence of the Zionist argument has always contained large elements of supremacism, attempts at justifying racial supremacism, and large elements of fascist thought. So again, this isn't a controversial thing. These are all, you can base these this case that the pamphlet makes on actual statements by the founders of Zionism and their modern day political descendants in Israel itself. You can find Israeli politicians saying that they are fascists, and they're on record in Israeli media as saying that. So again, this this isn't a particularly controversial point. Apparently the new background is making my right shoulder disappear. So I'll try and move a little bit closer to the camera, and this is an experimental graphic, so maybe we need to improve the camera angle. Right, so the point about it is that it's not a controversial case to make. You can fairly easily make this case based on just statements of Israeli politicians and the founders of Zionism. So why would the Metropolitan Police arrest 4 people for handing out a book or selling a book with this argument contained within it? Is it because there was an image on the front with the swastika inside the Star of David? Well, maybe that's probably what attracted them to it, I would imagine. I doubt they read it or read it. I think they looked at the front cover and reacted off that. But also we've got to bear in mind that the average cop on the street might not have 2 brain cells to rub together, but there are people in the British state who do. And they've been concerned, I think, that the Palestine Solidarity demos have gotten as big as they are and have gained a lot of popularity, and that the gap between the rhetoric of the politicians and the realities of the opinions of the population is huge. So they're worried about it. They've been making demands for arrests. They're looking to do it not using the anti-terrorism laws at this stage, which of course they could do. The anti-terrorism laws are written as so broadly in this country that they would, of course, be able to sweep up just about anybody for any act of protest at any time. And we can come to a discussion as to why they are so broad in a moment or two. But the fact that they arrested 4 of our comrades says that, first of all, it confirms that the arguments made inside the book, which the police took offence to, are correct. and we can judge this by making a comparison with all the other groups on the left. All the other groups on the left have an abysmal position, other than like a few very small ones. There's the Trots and the Khrushchevite revisionists in Britain, and I think the same is true elsewhere, have a terrible position on this. The position of the Khrushchevite revisionists in the CPB is against the national liberation fight of the Palestinian population. If you read their actual position, that is their actual policy. It's against the armed fight for national liberation. All the Trots are against the fight for national liberation, because all of them denounce the forces that are actually fighting for national liberation or completely misrepresent them. So they're handing out loads of stuff which says support the Palestinians. Then you go into their actual position and it's very much the opposite of that. So you can see why the state doesn't bother arresting any of them, because they're handing out stuff which, if you read it and take it seriously, at best you're just going to end up incredibly confused. Whereas what the party's handing out is the accurate way of analysing it. And if you read that pamphlet and if you read the other, or just the leaflet that's been handed out, then you'll have a much better and proper understanding of not just Zionism, but the role that Zionism plays inside the US-led imperialist system. And that's why they've done these arrests, basically. They're not going to arrest the SWP or any of the Trots or the Khrushchevite revisionists. They're only going to arrest people who are offering accurate analysis. And they're only going to arrest people if that accurate analysis is actually catching on. Free speech, of course, isn't real inside imperialist countries. It's only ever partial at best. If there was free speech, Julian Assange would not be in a prison cell, labelled as basically a terrorist and left to rot. Now, the limit of free speech in an imperialist country is the whole crux of this. The limit of it is not just what you say, because we could say the stuff that we're saying, and if it wasn't making any connection to workers, then the state wouldn't bother. If you're in a corner on your own, and if you're just basically a book group, and you're not making any connection with the masses whatsoever, then the state will probably spy on you, but largely leave you alone. The danger isn't just what you say. The danger is for the state is partially how you're saying it. So are you making a connection with the working class? That's the principal concern of the state. Is this getting a larger and larger audience? And are you conveying it in a way that will enable the working class to take that message back to their workplaces, back to their communities, and then make the argument themselves? And if you're making that connection, and if you're communicating in the right way with a message that is, of course, something which is very much against the interests of the ruling class, it's at that point that free speech hits its limit. To go back to the example of Julian Assange. Julian Assange is in prison right now, not for anything that they've actually thrown around legal-wise. He's in prison for not just revealing or publicising the crimes of US and British imperialism. He's in prison for doing it in such a way in that it reached a mass audience. That's what he's actually in prison for. So again, you go back to the question of free speech. The limit on free speech, it doesn't matter whether it's in Britain or the United States, even though the laws around speech are, of course, arguably stronger in terms of the defense of free speech in the US. But I would argue that the US state agencies can always trample right over those if they choose to. So the whole question of the limit of free speech is that, again, it's about, are you making an impact? And if you're not making an impact, then you have no limit on your speech, basically. The limit is, are you getting an audience? Are you popularizing? And Assange did, and that is why he's in prison. Obviously, we had started to, and that's why they made those arrests. Yes, and CJ points out in the chat that one of the cops said on the videos, free speech has its limits, I don't think the cop really understood what those limits were, but he's 100% correct, which is that the state will always decide when to when that limit has been reached, and that limit is the audience you're getting and the message that you're taking to them. Combine an accurate message with a widening audience, and free speech suddenly disappears and is completely curtailed for you. And now you got to the stage where, who knows, the police might try, or the government might try banning this particular book, in which case I think it's incumbent upon all of us to retitle it the book they tried to ban, which of course will immediately make it more popular. Their censorship attempts will not work, of course. There are 1,000 ways around this now, but it's not strictly meant to work. It's meant as intimidation, as something that's going to, they hope, put comrades off going on demonstrations and interacting with people. And I don't think that'll work. All of the comrades were released by around about 4:30 yesterday, with a series of ridiculous conditions, including restrictions on where you can go and what you can do as part of a demonstration. Again, it's an intimidation tactic, but it's all part of a growing picture that we see now across the imperialist countries of attempts at placing more and more extreme restrictions on what can be said, because the problem, again, to go back to the limitations of free speech here, the problem for the bourgeois states is that the system is failing, and more people are realizing that it is, and that creates a problem for them in that they can't and won't reform it. They won't reform anything in a way that benefits the working class in any way, and therefore their only option is to use repression. Repress what can be said, intimidate people. In the case of the French state in particular, engage in all kinds of brutalization. In the case of the German state, use cheap intimidation tactics to try and make support for Israel compulsory, particularly amongst those who are applying for German citizenship. And of course, the more broad picture is that the state will use any means it has at its disposal to sow as many divisions as possible between different elements of the working class. And that's the picture that we have. The only tool that the ruling class has at its disposal that it's prepared to use is repression, because there's no real way to actually reform the system. The only thing that the ruling class in Britain or anywhere else in Europe is prepared to consider, or even in the United States itself, is not just repression, but a management of this decline that the imperialist powers are undoubtedly in now, in order to shore up the system by making sure that the petty bourgeoisie, those that still benefit from imperialism, that is, within the petty bourgeoisie, because it's not all of them, are kept in line and behind the system for now, in order that the system can get them squeeze a few more years out of it before total collapse comes. So that's their only plan at this stage. Now, we may get to the point where they decide to go for open, more, what shall we say, less disguised fascism, but that's the drift that we're in right now. Right, I'm going to pause for comments from the floor, so to speak. We've got Irish Partisan, who says the arrest of the CPGBML activist was a purely political nature. It's telling that a small party like the CPGBML is in the crosshairs of the establishment, whereas the CPB isn't. Yeah, the CPB is a in-house party for the British ruling class now. Its leadership certainly are. I've met certain of its members who seem to still think or want the party to be something other than what it is. But what it is a vote Labour operation. What it is essentially the left wing of the trade union bureaucracy. It's completely useless. Anybody who's in it and is actually a sincere communist, and there are those that are, I would recommend that you leave as soon as possible, because it's not going to fulfill anything other than acting as a support network as a supporter of the system. That's what it's there to do. It's there to corral radicalism and push it back towards the Labour Party again. That's what the CPB is. Jerry says they're going to put a sticker over that paddle logo on the book cover. That might work. I mean, to be honest, I think the forces of the state in Britain, most of them are so incredibly stupid that if you put like a slightly different cover on most things, they wouldn't look twice at it. You can rely to a certain degree on the brazen stupidity of the state forces sometimes. CJ says, this is precisely Lukash's theories that irrationalism is guilty of being able to be appropriated by fascism and being its foundations. Yeah, I mean, if you look at 19th century, I would call sort of irrationalist and romanticist philosophers like Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard to a certain extent, certainly Nietzsche and others, it's all there within the fascist mythos. And yes, what the fascists said, of course, depended upon what audience that they were trying to appeal to at any given moment. Mussolini could make probably 3 different speeches and claim to be 3 different things inside about an hour. Hitler the same way. But one of the fundamental parts of it, and CJ is right to bring up Lukács, is that the fascist will always try to steer his audience towards irrationalism and also push them towards not being able to scientifically explain things. Push them towards completely irrational modes of analysis, or if you can even call it analysis, and towards hysteria, and towards not thinking, and towards the fanatical embrace of symbolism over an inquiry into actual reality. And that's why fascism is, of course, so well suited for capitalism in the stage of decay, because if you actually made a serious examination of the problems afflicting whether it's European societies in the 1920s or in the 2020s, you would find that at the heart of it lay the decaying capitalist system, producing a lot of the things that these fascist guys pretend to decry, but strangely always end up in movements that actually reinforce them. The fascist is, of course, also defined by the fact that they go on and on about order and discipline, but in actual fact, there's so much of fascism in Germany in particular, also in Italy, that is the flip side of the obsession with order and discipline is like squalor and decadence and depravity, and that's certainly the case with the fascists. Like if you look at the amount of drugs most of the Nazi hierarchy were on, it's quite phenomenal. Like I think Hitler himself was on a very interesting cocktail for a certain, not just the latter part of his life, but most of the 1930s. And certainly he was on a lot of speed, but also like the amount of like sexual degeneracy and like just sheer squalor that the Nazis practiced behind the scenes. It's almost like it's compulsory. It's the same as like the church ministers banging the pulpit and screaming about morality whilst at the same time being a sex offender. And it's a bit of a cliche, but the thing with cliches is that they start off with an essential truth, and is that in bourgeois societies, the obsession with order and the obsession with discipline is always in reality about imposing an order and discipline upon a subordinate class, principally the proletariat. That's what it's all about. And of course the fascist dresses that up in all manner of irrationalist and romantic language, and with appeals to nationhood and tradition and organic communities and things like that. And, you know, to restore order against the filth and the squalor of the communists and the leftists. I mean, to be honest, the arguments of the fascists now and the arguments of the fascists in the 1920s look remarkably the same, because the situation, though it has evolved, of course, or devolved, contains a lot of the same, to use Gramsci's term, morbid symptoms. And the fascist takes advantage of those morbid symptoms by banging the table and saying, look over there, this is a disgrace, look over there, this filth and squalor must not be tolerated, and demagoguing around things like poverty and unemployment, and offering solutions which in actual fact amount to getting the working class to accept increasingly like slave labor like conditions in return for, well, not being thrown in prison principally. But to go back to the sordid flip side of fascism's obsession with order, because the fascist is always seeking to impose order on the working class, principally to impose a ultra-violent form of bourgeois order on the working class in order to restore profitability. Therefore, fascism needs to find outlets for the pent-up anger and suppressed rage of its petty bourgeois base. That's where a lot of the impetus for the anti-Jewish pogroms and then the Holocaust ultimately comes from. But on the other side of it, the amount of like sleaze and depravity of the Nazis is actually something which is straight from the work of the Marquis de Sade, as expressed in a film which you will watch once and never want to watch again, which is Salo, the great film that was produced in I believe the 1970s, and is an adaptation of the Marquis de Sade's work, and it is done by, of course, the Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini, member of the Italian Communist Party, murdered in a political hit job. But the point about that film, and again, you will only watch it once if you do watch it, and the point about the Marquis de Sade's work, which it's based on, is that Sade saw something in early bourgeois society, which of course has been revealed to be more and more true over time, which is that the bourgeois frantically seeks to impose its order on the rest of society, whilst itself engaging in all manner of extreme depravities that would have made a Roman emperor blush behind closed doors. It's the irrational excesses in private are in part a manifestation of the contradictions that arise from being a dominant class at a time when you speak in the language of universal equality. They have to get the irrational perversions out somewhere. Some of that is imposed directly upon the working class, but the filth of capitalism, I guess this is Sade's argument, and the filth of bourgeois rule has to work itself out in private via wild and depraved excesses, which capitalism, as the most violent, most radical form of the reimposition of bourgeois order, exemplifies, of course, in the most extreme ways, all of the aspects of the contradictions of bourgeois society. Right, so more comments in the chat room. So we've got, David Green says he's read all the books behind me. Well, you're a quicker reader than me. James Graham says, you get the freedom, they get the power. True. Good afternoon to Slava. Good afternoon to my comrade Naylor. Ash says, the speeches given by Hitler to youth going viral on Twitter is a good example of how fascism encouraged irrational hysteria. It was so empty on substance but had the right words. People were reading it up. Well, yes, I mean, the Nazis, Mussolini beforehand, but also the Nazis were very effective at marshalling essentially big, empty slogans. I mean, a lot of like modern day political innovations, particularly in terms of bourgeois politics, communication with the masses, crafting a message which is utterly empty, but which is designed to hit irrational emotional chords. That was all something which Hitler didn't come up with it. Goebbels came up with a lot of it. But they were also helped by the capitalist press in Germany, particularly the media empire of a guy like Alfred Hugenberg. who came up with a lot of this stuff and was a big backer of Hitler. So the Hitler speeches, it's just like, you know, he'd have been a very big hit on Twitter, trust me. Because it's all this like stuff that you see like various amateur sort of trads and rightists doing now, like, you know, posting a picture of a cathedral and crying and saying, why can't we make this anymore? And it's like, well, because we've evolved beyond using hand tools to carve stone gargoyles out of. That's why. But yes, the Ash's point is correct, which is that it's designed to hit emotive points, whilst the content, of course, the actual political content, the class content of fascism is purely bourgeois. What the petty bourgeois stormtroopers, in Hitler's case quite literally, and the elements of the working class who go for it get is the emotive bits, and of course they get to kick down at a chosen out group, and that's basically all of bourgeois politics in reality, which of course leads us to the second item on the agenda, which is the Dublin riots, which took place at the end of last week. And this is resulting from, at least nominally, a stabbing incident that took place at a school in Dublin, which is, I still can't get a clear story as to exactly who the suspect is. It's important to say suspect. But what the Irish Times reported was that the suspect was a man in his 50s who was a naturalized Irish citizen. He'd been resident in the country for over 20 years, and he attacked and wounded a woman in her 30s outside a school, and wounded 3 children who presumably attended the school. And some of the stories say that this woman was either a teacher or a teaching assistant. There are other stories which claim that this man had some relationship to the woman and children that he wounded. He was eventually knocked out, it seems, by being beaten over the head with a motorcycle crash helmet by someone who was also a foreign national, long-term resident in Ireland, who hit this guy over the head. And the suspect, he's also in hospital with apparently quite bad injuries. So it sounds like he got twatted over the head with a motorcycle crash helmet, then a bunch of other people kicked the fuck out of him. And if he's done what he's accused of having done, then there ain't going to be much sympathy. So yes, as Irish Partisan says, it was a Brazilian and a guy and another local man who came to the rescue. So again, multiple stories about who the suspect is. So I'm not going to go into them because I don't know 100% if any of these are accurate. But the point is, the story got out there, and of course, due to the nature of the times we're living in, it gets on Twitter and TikTok and everywhere and goes viral. And then you end up with a bunch of guys, younger men largely, but not exclusively, turn up in Dublin city centre, have a ruck with the cops, burn some buses, brick in some tram windows, have a fight. And it goes all over the place, Dublin war zone, etc. Even though I suspect that, I mean, I've only been to Dublin once, but I suspect that other than a couple of streets, it probably wasn't that noticeable. But apparently it is the worst riot in Dublin for a number of years. The question is, of course, why does it happen? And you get all kinds of theories relating to migration, but there is a number of points to be made here, and I think that we need to go back to first principles in order to understand the conditions before we can actually comment on the causes as they stand right now. Now, the case I'm going to make to you on this broadcast is rooted around the fact that the central antagonism in the Republic of Ireland, which is the 26 counties of Ireland, is still the national question. That is still the principal contradiction. It's the principal antagonism, I should say, in Ireland today, is the national question, is the fact that for over 100 years, the island of Ireland has been partitioned between the 6 counties that are occupied by British imperialism in the north and the 26 counties which have a limited degree of independence in the south. And it has always been, from the very beginning, from the moment that Michael Collins and the others signed that partition deal, a limited form of independence. Why? Well, you have to go back and just look at the writings of James Connolly, who correctly analysed the fact that without socialism, Irish independence was going to be a paper constitution, a flag, even an army, but economically speaking, Britain will still rule Ireland. And that was true all the way through the 20th century. The biggest single trading partner for the Irish capitalist class is Britain. The biggest profits came from trading with Britain. Britain still dominated Irish markets when it came to manufactured goods for a very long time. Not so much anymore, mainly because British industrial productions dipped so much. But the dominant role of British imperialism in Ireland remained for many, many decades afterwards, and is still very powerful to this day, despite the fact that it has diminished somewhat. And the fact that the British still occupy the 6 counties in the north has a strong economic, political and cultural impact across all of the island of Ireland to this day. It prevents the formation of a single economic unit in the country, and that's exactly why, of course, the British still want to keep partition, no matter what might be said from time to time by individual British government ministers. The British ruling class still wants to keep the north of Ireland under British control. Now, of course, they might not get a choice for too much longer, but they don't want the north of the country to be reintegrated with the south. They find it much too useful to keep Ireland separated, to make sure that a single economic entity cannot emerge, to make sure that the occupied 6 counties can serve as a literal gun to the head of any Irish government which doesn't dance to the tune of British imperialism. That was true 100 years ago. It's true now. So when looking at the problems facing Ireland, the occupation, the national question, is still the biggest one, regardless of whatever else anybody else says. Without the unification of the country, all the other problems can't be solved either. Now, it must be said, though, that the Southern Irish, the capitalist class, in the 26 county republic, or as some still refer to it, the Irish Free State, the Southern Irish capitalist class are a completely degenerate and useless breed. They, of course, remained very close to the British for an awful long time, and to a large extent still are, but now you have the presence of American imperialism and the EU in Ireland as well, further diminishing the very, very weak sovereignty that the Irish capitalist class had established after the partition deal of the early 1920s. And you have various economic experiments by the Irish ruling class to try and develop the country, a lot of which end in failure. The most recent of which was, of course, the fabled and so-called Celtic tiger experiment, personified by the political figures like Bertie Ahern, former Irish Prime Minister. And this period of lower taxation, higher foreign direct investment, and rampant property speculation was a model that was so popular amongst bourgeois politicians that people like Alex Salmond of the SNP wanted to copy it. Then, of course, it all comes crashing to a halt in 2008 to 2010 with the dramatic recession. And another point before we go any further about the contradictions in Ireland, the Irish population, north and south, taking the whole island of Ireland now, is now around about 7 million. that's still 1 million lower than it was at the beginning of the 1840s, before the famine and the mass migration. Now, why do I mention that? Again, without an understanding of the history and its long-term impact, we can't possibly hope to understand today. The devastation inflicted upon Ireland by British imperialism over many decades, but particularly, I think, egregious in the 19th century, where they pursued a policy that led to the halving of the population, with over 1 million, it is argued, dying of starvation, and millions more being forced to emigrate to ultimately the United States mostly, but also Canada and Australia. So they halved the population, did a massive amount of consolidation of land ownership, and essentially converted Ireland into an agricultural colony. And this is all chronicled in the work of Karl Marx, especially Capital Volume 1. And James Connolly writes about this extensively as well. So when looking at the development of Ireland, you have to bear in mind that the gigantic crimes that the British ruling class inflicted upon that country when it was a colony. And this is something which you can't get away from, because that kind of horrific atrocity perpetrated by an occupying power, that has never been fully addressed. You now get like official British historians like that rat Simon Sharma going around going, oh, well, the British didn't mean to starve all those people to death. It just worked out like that. So the British don't want to address it and never will address it. But without understanding the dramatic collapse of the population, then you can't really understand subsequent developments in Irish history. Now, Ireland's also been defined, as I'm sure everybody here on this discussion knows, by successive waves of mass emigration out of the country. In, of course, the 19th century, which was encouraged and or forced by the British, but also into the 20th century as well. Principal locations still being, well, Britain itself being a big one, because the opportunities to work here were more diverse than they were in Ireland, but also United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And this was true after the collapse in 2008 to 10 as well, where you got over 300,000 Irish people, particularly younger workers, who were university educated, but also people who were just working class and wanted out, looking to get out and go elsewhere because the prospects in Ireland were so poor. And you see an increased reliance upon migration from other parts of the European Union, especially to fill the gaps that are left behind by those who leave, and also to bring in a new workforce that is going to be more pliable, that can be pushed into low wage jobs. And that, of course, is certainly true. Now, the biggest migrant groups in Ireland, according to the figures provided by the Irish government themselves, are mainly EU, mainly from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, but also there's a good deal from the southern Mediterranean, Italy and Spain, and there's a certain amount now from outside of the EU as well. But the principal groups there are, in terms of migrants, are from Britain itself, but mainly from the EU countries, now mostly from the Eastern European EU countries. On top of that, you got a lot of Ukrainian refugees there. So according to the various different indicators that I've looked at in preparation for this, there's now around about 645,000 people who could be accurately described as non-nationals in Ireland, which is about 13% of the population. And again, this is all part of the way in which the Irish ruling class has responded to the various crises of Irish capitalism over the years. They, of course, don't want to address the fact that Ireland is still dominated by British imperialism, both through the ongoing partition and also the set of economic relations that have existed since partition. And of course, their big go-to move is, or was at least for a long while, is of course having a favourable tax regime in order to entice various companies, including companies like Google and Apple, to stick their corporate headquarters in Dublin and say that they've attracted a great deal of foreign direct investment because a lot of money goes through Ireland and elsewhere. Not a lot of benefit to the Irish working class. And here we get to the question of like poverty and deprivation in Ireland, because this is where a lot of the fuel for the fire that broke out the other day actually comes from. So according to, again, I'm getting this from the Irish government's own statistical body, there are 671,183 people in the Republic of Ireland currently defined as living in poverty, of which 188,602 are children. Now that's quite some size for a population in terms of the Republic, which is just over 5 million. Now, according to the Irish government statistical body, 9.2% of the population are formally employed in full-time employment, but are suffering from deprivation. So that's almost 10% of the population of 5 million are employed, but in quite bad levels of poverty. Now, there's more to this, of course, and we could dive deeper into the statistics, and if there's demand for it, I will do. But what happened in Ireland during the so-called Celtic Tiger period was that certain incomes in the country grew quite rapidly, particularly in the petty bourgeoisie and some elements of the upper end working class in Ireland did see their incomes grow in the so-called Celtic Tiger period, but that mostly imploded. The role that the EU and EU membership has played in Ireland is important to understand, because there was a good deal of EU investment in infrastructure in the country during the 90s and 2000s in particular. But again, this tapers off to a great degree after 2008, and Ireland is identified as one of the problem areas facing the euro. Because again, Ireland is not in charge of its own monetary policy because, of course, it's in the European single currency. Its currency is managed from the European Central Bank, over which elected representatives of the country have minimal to no control whatsoever. The only real control over the euro lies within the German ruling class, principally. So Ireland, again, the limited independence gained by the heroic struggles of the Irish Republicans of the 1916 to early 1922 period has always been willingly sacrificed by the Irish ruling class in order to see if they can make a quick buck. So signing over the Irish control over their own currency and giving that up to an EU body is a fairly typical move from the Irish ruling class. Better to have it run by somebody else other than themselves, and then they can hide behind EU membership on the grounds that, well, we've got to accept not controlling our own currency or our own interest rates because ultimately this is something which we've given up for the marvellous benefits of EU membership. Now, it seems what seems to be the case is that there is still strong support for EU membership within the Irish petty bourgeoisie, just as there is within the English petty bourgeoisie, who associate EU membership with modernization, with getting away from what the liberal petty bourgeois regard as a sort of more barbaric past in Ireland. And therefore you do have a lot in certainly the younger end of the petty bourgeois as well, who still support EU membership, even though EU membership basically is fatal to smaller nations like Ireland, ultimately. And this isn't even before we get to the migration question, because not being able to control your own money, not being able to control your own currency, having economic policy essentially dictated to Ireland from ultimately Berlin, which is what happened in the 2008 to 2010 period. The governments then and to this day have been accepting the terms given to them by the European Commission, by the European Central Bank, and sovereignty be damned, essentially. So our EU membership, despite the fact that the EU's put its name on all kinds of infrastructure projects and has a solid base of support within the Irish petty bourgeois, EU membership for the Irish working class has done very, very little. And now you've got increasing numbers in Ireland sinking into poverty. You've got, according to Irish government statistics, just over 9,000 at least in the 26 counties that are using emergency shelters to live in. There's more and more people living in tents on the streets. There's more and more people who in Ireland who are suffering from the effects of being in full-time employment but not earning enough to live on. The unemployment rate's 4%, but the bigger problem is the fact that most of the regrowth in jobs since the recession in 2010 has been in more low-wage sectors, which is supported by the EU-wide labour pool, which the Irish capitalist class likes to draw on, to bring in people who might be more pliable than the Irish, to the native-born Irishmen to employ, because a lot of these people will come in, work for a while, and leave again. So the situation in Ireland has been one where the house of cards that was the so-called Celtic Tiger has collapsed. What's replacing it is essentially like an even more nightmarish version of what they tried before, based on, again, attracting so-called foreign investors, using favourable taxation schemes, trying to reinflate the housing bubble, growing jobs but in increasingly low-wage sectors, more and more people being in work poverty, more and more Irish workers not being able to afford to buy a home or even rent one at a decent standard. And so what you have is an increasing amount, and this is common also to bigger imperialist countries like Britain, but in Ireland you have an increasing amount of poverty, an increasing amount of in-work poverty, an increasing amount of despair amongst the working class population. And into this you throw in the fact the Irish government's been one of the biggest non-participating but supporting cheerleaders for the war on Ukraine, and then said, oh, we'll take any amount of Ukrainian refugees, because ultimately the Irish capitalist class want to use these people as cheap labour. That's why they're welcoming them in. It's nothing to do with humanitarian concerns. If they were actually being humanitarians about it, the Irish government would oppose the arming of the Ukrainian junta. So the whole question is over what happened on Friday of last week needs to be seen in that light. That you have an increasing section of the working class in Ireland, which is not, even if it is employed in the formal economy, is not making enough to make ends meet. Particularly those who are younger, increasingly frustrated, and the Irish left, other than the honourable exception of like the IRSP, most of the Irish left is dominated by petty bourgeois chancers who would not know how to remotely connect with the Irish working class on any single conceivable level. They're happy recruiting endless petty bourgeois students into their organisations and just denouncing anybody else as a horrific racist, which is what the Irish left has responded to these riots with. Now, it is true that racist organisations are active in Ireland and are trying to recruit people and are trying to stir things up there, the same way they are in the poverty-stricken areas of the English Northwest. You will have all seen the recent reports regarding the riot in the area called Kirklees, just outside of Liverpool. The same situation exists there, a depressed area, poorer end working class, no organisation to speak of from socialist or communist groups. The only active organisations there are, of course, fascist organisations who turn up usually with quite big budgets, usually from donations given to them by the fascist end of the bourgeois. So that these groups turn up and try and take advantage of this should be absolutely no surprise. So what's the way to look at this then? The way to look at this, in my view, is that with regard to the specific problems facing Ireland, that the national question has to be put to the forefront again, but also the socialism question. As to paraphrase Connolly, the cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland, and the cause of Ireland is the cause of Labour. And what needs to be foregrounded again is the fact that without the reunification of the country, but also without the taking over of the land, and without a planned economy in Ireland, then the Irish capitalist class has had 100 years, and it's proved over and over and over again that it cannot take Ireland to true independence. The independence that Ireland has now is incredibly limited, and it's limited by the fact that the Irish bourgeois remain tied hand and foot to imperialism, and so therefore are more than happy to surrender sovereignty if there's profit in it for them. So without resolving the national question, you can't resolve the question of poverty and the question of low wages and whole communities in the south and the north sinking into despair. And so how do you address the issue of these large numbers of angry younger men who are potentially falling prey to the false promises of the fascists in Ireland, some of whom, let's be honest, will be the active agents of British imperialism still? Because if British imperialism can lean into a crisis and use it to cause some problems in Ireland, they're going to do so. But the arguments need to be made now, not just in Ireland but elsewhere, that the capitalist class has absolutely no solution to these problems. They will play a double game with the working class constantly. They do this in Ireland. They do this in Britain all the time, which is, on the one hand, they will quite openly admit that there's no upper limit on immigration because capitalism needs a constant supply of fresh workers. The birth rates, both in Ireland and in Britain itself, are not high enough to replace those workers who are retiring and leaving the labour force. They need a bigger population. They need a bigger labour pool. And the only way they get that is through migration. At the same time, they play a double game on everybody. They, on the one hand, try and get everybody to hold hands and wave a friendship banner and say immigrants are welcome here, we love diversity. On the other hand, they stoke the anti-migrant sentiment amongst the population. They whip up racialist divisions because this is standard practice for running a class society, from taking their lessons from the British ruling class, both inside Britain and in the old colonies as well, which is you have to, as a capitalist, make sure that the different layers of the working class are separated by as many different means as you possibly can. And if on the one hand you're funding and organising groups which are saying immigrants welcome here, sing kumbaya, and on the other hand you're also whipping up anti-migrant sentiment, and you're part of the bourgeois class is funding open fascist organisations, this is all how the bourgeois dictatorship works. You keep people on the one hand screaming racists, and you whip up the poorer end working class and ruined petty bourgeois to scream fuck the commies, they're trying to erase us on the other side. And without a class-based approach, and in the case of Ireland, a class-based approach which foregrounds the national question and its resolution through reunification on a socialist basis, if you're not doing that, then you're going to go nowhere. You're going to go absolutely nowhere. Of course, that's the one approach that the Irish ruling class and their masters in London and Washington aren't going to want you to take, but it's the only one that's going to work. The only way you are going to be able to break this cycle, break the angry younger guys out of this dead end which the fascist groups are going to take them down, and also break the more upper end working class and petty bourgeois leftists out of their dead end of just every time this happens screaming, "You're all thugs, immigrants welcome here," is through a combined campaign to resolve the national question and fight for socialism. Now, when I was younger, and this is a case of as you get older, you realize what realism actually is. When I was in my early 20s and late teens, I always said that. I don't think I really knew what it meant at the time. I also didn't believe it. I also thought that, okay, we can say this, but perhaps we need a so-called practical policy with regard to this question. But now I'm older and I've experienced more of capitalism and what it has to offer, the very dubious things it has to offer. You look at this and you actually analyze it, and you have to come to the realization that no, this situation in Ireland with regard to how the bourgeois are manipulating the immigration question and how they're trying to use it to essentially ignore or bury the national question, bury the question of which class holds power in Ireland. All of this, it can only be overcome by a unified fight for a Republic of Ireland, a unified Republic of Ireland, with under a socialist system where the working class is elevated to becoming the ruling class. Only Irish Republican socialism revived can actually find a way out of this situation. And it's a situation where none of the Irish bourgeois parties, whether they're in the 26 counties or in the occupied 6 counties, are going to find any solution for the working class, whether it's a working class that used to describe itself as unionist, or a working class in the south, or the working class in the north that is amongst the nationalist communities. British imperialism's got nothing to offer. The areas of the working class in the north that used to be described as the Protestant working class or the unionist working class, it's got nothing to offer them other than what we were discussing earlier, which is banging the drum, quite literally in the case of the Orange Men, the symbolism of the Orange state, the petty prejudices that they are allowed to engage in through the continued British occupation, or in the case of the South, all the bourgeois are going to offer you there is symbolism to play with, reactionary symbolism to play with. They're going to allow you to talk more about immigration. They're going to encourage more political expressions on the right, on the bourgeois right, that can absorb the dissent that's emerging as the Irish capitalist economy sinks further into failure and more Irish workers sink into poverty along with it. Again, the only way out of this is a rebirth of the socialist republican struggle, in my view. Please let me know if you disagree. Because what other way through this is there for Ireland? What other way through this other than addressing the national question, other than being able to actually have a planned economy for the whole of the island of Ireland that is able to actually maximise the still very useful resources that Ireland does have available to it? Agricultural resources, certainly, but also areas that could be industrialised. Because remember, Ireland actually got significantly deindustrialised, the Republic did, after independence. And the amount of railway laid in the country actually reversed under the Irish ruling class, because all that the British ruling class were prepared to actually buy from Ireland, ultimately, was agricultural products. And so the British ruling class wanted it as rural and undeveloped as possible for that reason. So again, it might seem like a cheap phrase, but it's not. But only socialism has the answer, and it's a socialism which, of course, cannot be accommodated to EU membership in Ireland, because EU membership is being used to crush the Irish worker, to make the Irish worker pay for the speculations and the speculative activity of the Irish banking sector and the Irish property magnates, both in the past and now. It's being used just the same way it's used to crush the life out of the Greek working class, or the Spanish, or the Portuguese, or even the Italian, even the bigger countries like France ultimately EU membership is used to enforce the will of the bourgeois and to use the bureaucratic methods of management that they have at their disposal to pass the costs of these crises onto the working classes all the way across Europe. And that is the same in Ireland. So the anti-EU position in Ireland needs to be, and I think the IRSP does this, much more boldly stated, in that not only does the EU have no solutions for Ireland, it is an active barrier to the fight for a unified socialist Irish Republic, and therefore needs to be much more vigorously opposed. And only the socialist way out is going to work. No amount of tinkering with the migration levels, trying to restrict non-EU migration, trying to find opt-outs for the free movement of labour within the EU. None of that is going to fly. None of that is going to work. It doesn't work in Britain either, because the need of the capitalists for that labour is constant. So to pretend that you can have some kind of manipulation of the laws whereby, well, if we have less people coming in, and some social democrats argue this, that somehow the Irish capitalist class might start investing more in Ireland, we might get a more productive form of capitalism, we might get a greater degree of unionization, we might have more working class solidarity if we can somehow restrict migration into Ireland. Well, it's simply a utopian proposition. To believe that you can do that is far more utopian than just to be honest and say the only way through this is a fight for the renewal of the nation via reunification and a move to a planned economy. That's the way it has to happen. For the small nations, it is the only way you're going to get anywhere. And not just for the small nations, for the larger nations too. But the idea that by sticking in the EU, that the Irish working class is going to get anything out of this is ridiculous. It's going to get crushed, just like the Greeks are. And yes, we should be honest that socialist revolution, reunification of a country in the case of Ireland, is going to be a intense political struggle that is going to create years of potential difficulty. Hopefully it would be accompanied by a revolution in Britain as well, but there's no reason why anybody has to hang around for the imperialist countries to come around to the idea of socialism. But ultimately, this is a system which is at a dead end. And the only thing the Irish ruling class has on offer to the Irish working class now is manipulations, is, again, as I said, symbolism, is whipping up racism on the one hand and fraudulent anti-racism on the other, and having the two groups then fight it out whilst the Irish capitalist class continues to laugh all the way to the bank. Right, I'm going to pause there for further comments. Jerry says, another problem with the English language, you said those in poverty were formally employed. Yes, I meant formal as in formal attire, as in formal employment, not as formally. That's the answer to that particular question. Right, been going for an hour now, so I'm just going to pause for a quick drink. It's water, not vodka, by the way. So, other points on the agenda today. We got the Geert Wilders thing, but I think I want to devote more time to that in a future episode. I'll just skirt over it briefly now, which is to say that Wilders is a kind of an expression of what the bourgeois have on offer for you under their wonderful system, which is that he will, of course, and he says that one of his principal inspirations is Margaret Thatcher. So, and of course, he's also rabidly pro-Israel. But the popularity of Wilders just points to the fact that the Dutch political system, the Dutch bourgeois political system, has driven itself into a dead end. Now, Wilders, of course, comes to prominence 15 years ago at least, following on from another Dutch politician who was running on fairly similar lines, a guy called Pim Fortuyn, who was assassinated in the early 2000s. Wilders came to prominence by being anti-migrant, but also making a series of statements about Islam, saying it had no place in the wonderful, tolerant world of the Netherlands. Laugh all you want about that if you know the history of Dutch imperialism. but also that he would get in and oppose certain measures taken by the EU. The guy is, of course, a virulent anti-communist. I would put him in a similar category to like the Polish reactionaries. He's basically a slightly sort of less effective version of somebody like Orban, perhaps. But it's basically the guy is just a fairly standard right-wing liberal who's adopted a lot of like over-the-top rhetoric about Muslims and immigration in order to mark himself out from the crowd. Now, it says that he's anti-EU. He's actually not. He knows which side the bread is buttered here. He knows very well that the Dutch ruling class are implacably opposed to any move out of the EU. They are one of the principal beneficiaries of EU membership, the ability to move their capital around Europe in an unrestricted fashion, and their ability to be part of EU-wide trade deals has been enormously profitable for Dutch imperialism, which is still very much a thing. And so the Dutch capitalist class is not going to accept a politician to be in charge of a major imperialist country and to want to take it out of an organization like the EU, which has benefited enormously from. So what Wilders is actually in favor of is sort of cosmetic changes to the EU, changes over migration, particularly from non-EU countries. That's what he's actually in favor of. And even for like people like Meloni, who's very much of a similar ilk, they talk a very big game, as did Salvini in Italy, about restoration of sovereignty, getting out of the euro, maybe even getting out of the EU. But when the hammer comes down from the ruling class, all of these big-time right-wing guys just end up crumbling like a meringue being hit by a sledgehammer, because they can't. The nature of their movements is that they are enthusiastic capitalists. And so if the capitalist class says no, well, what are they going to do? So Wilders, and again, like he's portrayed as mad, bad, and dangerous, which I think suits him just down to the ground. The characters like him, also to a certain extent, Milei in Argentina, they like to be portrayed as like these dangerous outlaw figures. In actual fact, when you dig into their programs, they're fairly standard politicians. In Wilders' case, fairly standard, like right-wing liberal. In Milei's case, of course, he's got a few more eccentricities, but fundamentally he is about, he's from the most reactionary end of the Dutch ruling class and is looking to attack principally the Dutch working class. He'll do this dressing it up in a lot of rhetoric about fighting multiculturalism, restoring Dutch values, the usual guff that we were talking about earlier, the usual stuff that these like reactionary characters like to throw out there as emotive appeals in order to cover up what they're actually doing, which is seeking to restore or boost profitability by endlessly attacking the working class, but by trying to divert any oppositional energy towards like culturalist movements or any other safe area that dissent can be pushed into. That's what Wilders is doing. It's what Meloni is doing in Italy. It's what ultimately a lot of these like right-wing so-called populists, it's ultimately what Marine Le Pen would do. It's what Macron is doing. I saw there was a stabbing incident in France where a quote-unquote migrant was blamed for it recently. And then one of Macron's ministers came out and said, well, France is on the edge, which strikes me as a rather absurd statement from a minister in a government that's been, it's into its second term. Well, if France is on the edge, minister, then who put it on the edge? I mean, it's such an absurd attempt to escape responsibility saying that. That you've been in office for what, 5 years, almost 6 years, and you have not only made an enemy, of course, of the entire French working class, you've secured the continual decline of French capitalism and the decay of that society, and now you come out following a criminal attack and say, oh, French society's on the edge. Well, who the fuck put it there? I mean, it's a completely ridiculous statement, but again, like, this is what they like to do. Those in power seek to always declaim or say they have no responsibility for any of these things that are happening. It has to be an external conspiracy that did this. But yeah, Wilders, again, likes to be portrayed as mad and bad. He's neither of those things. He's straight out of a more right-wing liberal tradition in European politics. Again, a man who says his principal inspiration is Margaret Thatcher isn't some sort of dangerous radical. He's a fairly standard capitalist response to an ongoing and deep-rooted problem in capitalism, and that response is attack the working class whilst at the same time whipping up all this irrational stuff to provide distraction politics to disguise what you're actually doing. So I would argue that Wilders is not only not threatening to the bourgeois, he's what the bourgeois in the Netherlands need at this time, because they're all, the party of Mark Rutte, etc., is all collapsed. They're all despised. So you get somebody who's going to come along and he's going to say, you know what, I'm the guy that's going to fight the globalists. I'm the guy that they're afraid of. Look how their press reacts negatively to me. I'm going to clean house. We need to make sure we're standing up for Dutch values, whatever they are, again, and our culture, etc. Come along with me and I'll show you the way. And this is the way in which the ruling classes of Europe are going to respond. It's how they're already responding. Again, like the Eastern Europe set the trend, the post-communist states, because in the 90s you got a lot of like ultra reactionaries in power in places like the Baltic states, but in places like Hungary and Poland to a degree and Bulgaria, you got a lot of ex-communist parties who rebranded themselves as social democrats getting voted for because they promised to essentially be social democrats, whereas in actual fact what they were being was the frontline fighters for the German ruling class in making sure that all elements of the prior existing socialist system were completely erased, and that was all done by social democratic parties. So once that's all been done and the conditions inside a place like Poland are reduced, the working class has been more atomized, more people have fallen into despair, what you get is a response from the bourgeois on the right who can capture the dispossessed oppositional energy that the left has created by being the enforcer for the capitalist class for over a decade, and channel all of that into a form of reactionary politics. And of course, that form of reactionary politics then, because it takes on a certain life of its own, may come into conflict to a degree, as the Polish reactionaries have done, as the Hungarian reactionaries have done, with the central bodies of the German ruling class and the European Union. But fundamentally, these are bourgeois forces. Yes, they're all fighting amongst themselves now due to the crisis of the system, but the root of them all goes back to, of course, the fact that they tried more than anything else to stamp out socialism in the late 80s and into the 1990s. And the level of despair and atomization that comes about is able to be exploited by reactionary pro-capitalist forces that, again, funnel dissent towards safe channels for capital. All of these forces are now having rows with each other about Ukraine, about the EU, about certain aspects of EU social policy, but fundamentally these forces are all on the same side, and they will reunify quicker than you can snap your fingers if there's a socialist threat on the horizon, or the threat of a more unified Polish or Hungarian working class or German working class emerging. So my point here from all of this is that none of these reactionary forces, whether they are in Ireland or whether they are in Poland, have anything to actually offer. The danger for us in Western Europe is that we're following the same process that's been underway in the East, which is that you have a completely impotent, not just from the point of view of the working class, but a left which becomes a tool of, in the case of Eastern Europe, the German imperialists and the American imperialists. Whilst at the same time, the life gets worse, and you should be having a response from an organized working class party, or a response from a communist party to organize that dissent into effective class-based political organizing. If that doesn't happen, then the bourgeois rightists will provide a perverted reflection of that. And the danger for everybody is that because that's a political expression that is allowed and promoted, and because the leftists are either completely in-house and captured by the bourgeois, or in the case of the imperialist countries, are run by a labour aristocracy which doesn't want to rock the boat above everything else, what you end up with is a lot of working class oppositional energy being captured by these bourgeois right-wing political projects. Yes, that'll only happen on a temporary basis, but it creates a hell of a lot of problems. And in our case, in Britain, the problem lies in the fact that, again, the labour aristocracy completely dominates the so-called left. It completely dominates all of the trade union organisations, and working class dissent is always pushed by the bourgeois towards racialist parties, towards openly fascist parties, which can be whipped up, used to scare people for a while, and then what the bourgeois hope to do is to then, once they've whipped them up, then demonize them, arrest a load of them, and cast them down again once they've served their purpose of dividing the working class, creating confusion, and scaring enough of the petty bourgeoisie to vote for the establishment party all over again. And this is the game, and we need to break out of the game. The rules need to be, we need to break out of these narrow channels that the bourgeois have established for the funneling of dissent into acceptable and safe territories for them. And that's where I'm going to conclude things today, because we've been going for an hour and a half or so. But I will be back again with more upon this tomorrow. I didn't get time. The reason why I'm not doing the Russia update today is I didn't get time to properly research where things have got to in Avdiivka. And I need to go and do more reading about that to give you a proper update. So that'll be tomorrow. But I'll thank everybody who has joined the stream today. I hope that you've got a lot out of it. I'll be back again tomorrow. So now I will hand you back over to your musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga Don Canal.